Cursed Scroll. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, this was one of the most heavily played cards in Tempest Block Constructed, Standard, and Extended. It was such a problem that it even got banned in the block format. For one generic, this is an artifact with an activated ability that costs 3 generic, and you tap it and choose a card name before revealing a card at random from your hand. If the card you reveal has the chosen name, the scroll does 2 damage to any target. To today's players, this artifact probably doesn't look particularly intimidating. After all, 3 mana for 2 damage isn't exactly impressive, and this won't always be able to do damage since it's a random effect. But trust me, this thing was a powerhouse back in its day. Because this card looks so underwhelming by today's standards, that begs the question, how good was Cursed Scroll, actually? This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. Use the links in the description to visit their store. Hi everyone, I'm Nitzahone, and it's time for another edition of How Good Was It?, a series where I examine the competitive history of cards whose best competitive days are behind them. I always run a poll to determine the topic of these videos, so go check out the community tab if you want to have a say in the next one. This time around, Cursed Scroll beat out Mass Decor in a pretty close race. So, let's answer the question that so many of you want to know. How good was Cursed Scroll, actually? Let's start by taking a look at how the card performed at the Tempest Block Pro Tour in 1998, because that will go a long way towards explaining what exactly made the scrolls so powerful. Block Constructed was a format where only 3 consecutively released sets were legal. These were sets that were tied together mechanically and by lore. In this case, we're talking about Tempest, Stronghold, and Weatherlight. At Pro Tour Los Angeles in 1998, 3 of the top 4 decks were packing Cursed Scroll. For that particular event, we've only got the top 4 recorded, so if we could look at the top 8, the number might be even sillier, but 3 out of 4 is pretty amazing too. Anyway, all 3 of the decks that used the scroll were aggro decks, including the deck that won the event, David Price's Dead Guy Red deck. We'd call this deck Red Deck Wins today, as it's a deck filled with cheap, efficient red creatures you can curve out with, and lots of sources of direct damage, and this is the absolute perfect home for Cursed Scroll. So the main thing that probably gives you pause about the scroll is the whole name a card thing. The best way to get around that potential downside of the card not doing anything is simply to have a very fast deck that puts you in top deck mode early in the game. At that point, the Cursed Scroll becomes a repeatable source of 2 damage that works every single time you activate it. This is because you can simply name the card you draw each turn and activate the scroll. So, for a mono-red aggro deck that quickly plays all the cards in hand, Cursed Scroll becomes an amazing source of damage that can easily allow you to close out a game, or get problematic blockers out of the way. If you've ever played a red aggro or burn deck, you know having a repeatable, guaranteed source of damage is amazing. Furthermore, the scroll's ability to hit creatures was substantially better back in the late 90s than it is today. This is because we're talking about an era of Magic where the main thing that creatures did was attack and block, and they often had 2 or less toughness. This meant just dealing with creatures that were on the battlefield was a lot better because they didn't all have enter the battlefield abilities or death triggers. Additionally, Cursed Scroll allowed you to get around cards that were designed to keep red decks in check. In particular, creatures with protection from red, like Soltari Priest, are suddenly very easy for red decks to deal with if they use the scroll. It also works nicely against Circle of Protection Red and other effects that are designed to prevent a player from taking damage from red decks. The other 2 decks in that top 4 that used the scroll weren't mono-red aggro decks. They were mono-black and mono-white, and that's one of the problems with the scroll. Like Umezawa's Jite, which we looked at last week, Cursed Scroll is colorless and thus can be jammed into any deck. This led to the card being ubiquitous not only in Block, but in other formats too. Ultimately, the scroll had to get banned in Block Constructed to put an end to aggro dominance in the format, and especially mono-red aggro. If the idea of banning this card sounds crazy to you, let me draw your attention to a much more recent banning of a similar card. I'm talking about Ramen OP Ruins, a card that got banned in Standard in January 2018. It's a desert that comes with an activated ability that costs 2 generic and 2 red, and you sacrifice a desert, and it does 2 damage to each opponent. This is really similar. Unlike the scroll, it's free to get on the battlefield and can produce mana until you need it to do damage, but other than that, Ruins is significantly worse than the scroll. It demands red mana for its activated ability, the ability is more expensive, and it can only ever hit players. Furthermore, you need deserts to sacrifice or it isn't repeatable. You can only do 2 damage once in many cases. And yet, Ramen OP Ruins also got banned because it made red aggro decks too good, in standard in its case. I think both the banning of the scroll and the ruins show us that mono red aggro decks can easily end up unbalanced if the design team isn't careful. Neither the scroll or ruins are cards that you look at and you immediately think, uh-oh, this is gonna break a format. But it turns out if your deck's main weakness is that it runs out of gas after an early onslaught that leaves your opponent with a low amount of life, giving that style of deck a repeatable way to do direct damage is just too much for other decks in many formats to handle. While the scroll didn't get banned in any formats other than Block, it did go on to significant success in all of Magic's other 60-card formats apart from Vintage. Standard and Extended would be the other formats where it was dominant. There were 2 separate World Championships that really showcase how widespread this card was. At the 1998 World Championship, 4 of the top 8 decks were aggro decks running Cursed Scroll. In this case, 3 of these decks were Sly decks, which were mono red aggro, and 1 of them was White Weenie. Standard had a much larger pool of cards than Block did, including even more efficient creatures than were available in Tempest Block alone, and even better direct damage effects than were available in the Block. And yet, 4 Cursed Scrolls remained one of the core attributes of mono red decks for as long as the scroll was legal in Standard. After all, emptying your hand and doing tons of damage to your opponent while you do it was still the game plan. As great as the 1998 World Championship was for Cursed Scroll, the 1999 World Championship was even more impressive. In fact, the 1999 World Championship was one of the most impressive single-event performances for any card in the history of competitive Magic. That's because 8 of the top 8 decks at the event ran Cursed Scroll, and they weren't just running 1 or 2. No, 6 of the top 8 decks ran a full 4, and the other 2 decks ran 3. In other words, of a 32 possible copies of Cursed Scroll in the top 8, there were 30. And this on Magic's grandest stage, the World Championship. This is Oko Thief of Crowns level of dominance. While most of the decks in this top 8 were aggro decks like those we've already seen, including mono red and mono black, there were also 3 mono green aggro decks which were made viable thanks to the printing of Rancor, and while those were a bit different than what we've seen so far in terms of color, the game plan was pretty much the same. Just play lots of aggressive 1 and 2 drops and use the scroll to close out the game if you need to. But the deck I want to spend the most time on from this event is Kai Buddha's deck, which he piloted to one of his many first place finishes. Because it was way different than any other Cursed Scroll deck we've seen so far, and it shows that the scroll was viable even outside of aggro decks. Full disclosure, the 1999 World Championship was the first Worlds I was ever aware of as a young Magic player. Kai Buddha is my favorite pro of all time, and this deck had a big influence on me, turning me into a land destruction player, so maybe my praise for this deck is a little bit effusive, but bear with me, because Kai is arguably the best player of all time, and he went in an awesome direction, given what the metagame looked like. So Kai's deck was mono red, but it didn't have the same kind of strategy as other Cursed Scroll decks did. After all, it only has 8 creatures. His deck was largely about assembling lots of fast mana, like Ancient Tomb, City of Traders, and a bunch of mana rocks like Grim Monolith. Once you did that, you could cast Wildfire, sometimes as early as turn 3. Because everyone was playing these low-to-the-ground aggro decks, when you did that, you'd usually wipe their board while destroying all of their lands. While Wildfire is symmetrical, Kai would always come out ahead because of all those mana rocks. At that point, your opponent would largely be locked out of the game, and one of the ways the deck could win was Cursed Scroll. You still had plenty of colorless mana thanks to your Monoliths and Thran Dynamos, so activating the scroll in the aftermath of Wildfire was pretty easy. This could often burn your opponent out before they ever had a chance to rebuild. One other interesting piece of synergy for this deck was how the scroll worked with Masticore. You could use your mana rocks to get this creature into play too, and if you were in a spot where you had too many cards in your hand to use the scroll consistently, the Masticore could help you get there, since it made you discard every turn. So frequently, this deck would lock the opponent out of the game for all intents and purposes, and then play a Masticore and a Cursed Scroll, at which point you could do 6 a turn to your defenseless opponent. Kai's use of Cursed Scroll has actually gone on to be the more enduring one, as various types of prison and resource denial decks over the years have run the scroll as a win condition, especially in Legacy, but more on that later. Ultimately, Cursed Scroll only stopped being played in Standard as a result of rotation. Cursed Scroll also had lots of success in Extended. Extended is a now-defunct rotating format that featured the last several years of cards, and Cursed Scroll was largely played in aggro decks in that format for as long as it was legal there, in other words between 1998 and 2004. Decks to use the scroll included red-white aggro, mono-black aggro, red deck wins, and burn. At this point, you understand what made the scroll so good in that style of deck, so I won't bore you by going deep on what these decks look like. Suffice it to say, they were still loaded up with cheap creatures and sources of direct damage, and the scroll was a format-defining card in the format for as long as it was legal there. Legacy is the final format where Cursed Scroll has made an impact, and while it has never been as dominant there as it was in Block, Standard, or Extended, it has consistently seen play in Legacy ever since it started to receive significant support as a format in 2005. At first, it was largely played in more aggro and burn decks, but it also carved out a new home that was significantly different from anything we've seen so far, apart from, perhaps, Kaibuda's Wildfire deck. Cursed Scroll has seen play in Legacy Pox decks since 2008. These decks get their name from Pox and Smallpox, two black sorceries that have a symmetrical effect that make both players lose lands, creatures, and life, as well as cards in hand. Beyond that, the deck is filled with other disruption and resource denial. Sinkhole can destroy more lands, and Hymn to Turok can make your opponent discard even more cards. So once you're able to completely cripple your opponent with all of that nonsense, you have to find a way to win the game, and Cursed Scroll is one of the many ways you can pull this off. Smallpox and Pox will make sure you don't have that many cards left, so as usual it becomes a source of damage 100% of the time when you activate it. It'd be a stretch to say that Pox decks were ever a huge factor in Legacy, but they've made intermittent appearances in the format over the last 16 years, and Cursed Scroll is frequently one of the deck's win conditions. And actually, in recent years, Cursed Scroll has actually seen an uptick in how often it's played. This is because of Urza's Saga, which was printed in 2021. This saga delivers insane value with each of its chapters, but Chapter 3 is the one that matters most for Cursed Scroll. It lets you tutor up an artifact that costs 0 or 1 and put it on the battlefield. This has led to Pox decks running a singleton Cursed Scroll to tutor up more often. And the scroll has even started to see a bit of play in artifact decks in Legacy 2, where sometimes a scroll is what you need to win the game, so grabbing one with Urza's Saga is a good idea. The scroll is a good way to win the game against prison decks that stop you from attacking with things like Ensnaring Bridge, or decks that keep you from being able to cast spells with Chalice of the Void. So Cursed Scroll still sees play today, although it isn't heavily played by any means. Interestingly, despite being such an important and iconic card from the late 90s to the mid-2000s, Cursed Scroll hasn't had that many cards that were designed as an homage to it, at least compared to other cards we've looked at in this series. Time Spiral's Magus of the Scroll is the only direct reference to the card. This creature was part of a cycle of Maguses that reference iconic permanents from Magic's past. These were creatures with activated abilities that were usually identical to the card they reference. It is notable that they decided to make this Magus red. That shows you just how red-aligned this activated ability really is. Like the card it references, Magus of the Scroll was successful in red aggro decks, although it only ever performed well in Block and Standard. Now that we've looked at the narrative of Cursed Scroll's competitive success and discussed its legacy, let's take a look at the numbers. Cursed Scroll has achieved 11 World Championship top 8s, including 1 win, 10 Pro Tour top 8s, including 1 win, and 25 Regional or Grand Prix top 8s. To sum up, Cursed Scroll is a sneaky, powerful source of direct damage. This led to it dominating Block constructed so thoroughly it had to get banned, while also being one of the most heavily played cards in Standard and Extended. And even today, it's being played in Legacy. As underwhelming as it is on your first read, I honestly think if it got reprinted in Standard today, it'd be a card that would be used by the format's most aggressive decks to close out games. So that's the history of Cursed Scroll. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to catch up on past videos in this series, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.